Hi, welcome back to another episode of Minds Behind Maps. I'm Maxim Lunneman, and this is the third episode in this experiment I'm trying where I want to sit down with people who are creating and using anything geospatial to try to understand more about the field and the people in it. I got to sit down with Denise McKenzie this time to talk about location data, ethics, and policy making. Denise is one of the first people I actually wanted to talk to when I thought about starting this podcast, as I've been seeing a lot more talk about topics around ethics and just data science in general that have started to emerge more and more, mostly with some quite heated moments. I've been wondering how things were going in the geospatial field as someone working in it. I mean, we do have GPS trackers in our pockets and on our wrists after all. This was an interesting conversation for me, as I think it's the one that I've learned the most from so far. Listening back at the conversation while editing, I can hear that I didn't really know as much as I think I do from our conversation, which is great. This is exactly why I wanted to do this in the first place. I hope that I could get people who know more about me on the specific topics, and that throughout these conversations, I get this feeling of having learned something walking away, or, more realistically, just closing our video call. I feel like I'm just getting started in this field, and I'm glad to be able to have conversations with people like Denise, who, first of all, are kind enough to sit down through some of my probably naive, though sometimes on purpose, I must confess, questions, and still have the patience to answer them. As always, I hope you enjoy this as much as I did going through this, and hopefully Denise as well, that you'll also be able to take something out of it and find something useful out of our conversations. Again, as usual, please feel free to drop me a line via email. I'll put the links in the show notes, but if you're like me, you're probably lazy to go and check those out, so it's minds.behind.maps@gmail.com. Or even better, I'm quite active on Twitter, so that's at Max Lunnerman, where you can feel free to drop me a line as well. Like the people I've had so far, I think it's worth checking out a bit more in detail the work that Denise and her team are doing. There's going to be links in the show notes if, unlike me, you're not too lazy to go check. This is probably really worth taking a look. In the meantime, here's our conversation with Denise McKenzie. First of all, thanks a lot for being here. This is really cool. I'm pretty excited about this. So I've done this. I've asked this question in the past, and I kind of like it. So, how would you describe yourself?
Oh, I guess these days, career-wise, I would describe myself as a geospatial evangelist. Would be the sort of description I would give. I generally what I do now is I connect people. I look at different areas of the geospatial profession and see how we could better connect those as well. Explore the bits where there's gaps. But really, I'm kind of I guess, a strategic advisor when it comes to looking at the broad spectrum that the geospatial profession can encompass.
And so, what does that mean on your? What is your from? So let's go on the career path there.
Yep.
What does that mean on your day to day? What is it that you do? Like, I have a bit of a hard time understanding that. So, and playing a devil's advocate, like, what does that mean?
Engage in on a day-to-day basis. So at the moment, I'm a consultant, so I'm fairly variable in the different activities that I might take on. So the current major piece of work that I'm doing is as a consultant on the benchmark initiative, which is one of the directors. And so that's delving into looking at what the ethical and responsible use of location data is, and within that, looking at we have obviously recently developed an international charter. But then that evangelizing part comes into it at that point. So using, I guess, the international network of people and organizations that I've worked with over the last 20 years, how do we take the information and knowledge that needs to be shared around the ethical use of location data out to the broader profession and community in that regard? So a lot of what I've done over the 20 years of my career is looking at that nexus of how public and private partnership works. And how you improve the use of geospatial data through those partnerships, and how you build communities around different problems and different issues that geospatial can solve.
So this might be a stupid question, but why is it important? Why is the work you're doing around location data, why is that important work to be done?
So one of the great things about geospatial data is how applicable it is to everything, but that's also its greatest challenge.
Mm-hmm.
The work that we do, I guess a lot of the work that I do is saying, okay, well, it's so broad and it's so applicable to everything, but how do we narrow that down? How do we funnel it so that it helps the transport problems we've got, or the sustainability problems that we've got, or the community or social problems that we've got? So the work within that, and I guess the ethics work within that, becomes also, well, what are the ethical challenges between each one of those different problem sets as well? How do we responsibly use location data in order to help solve those problems? And importantly, I think, how do we often take something that is quite technical and quite detailed and provide an explanation and an understanding for the decision makers so that they can proactively and educate, and in an educated way, use that information to make better decisions. We talk a lot about evidence-based decision making and how geospatial supports that. But getting from a technical solution and the great detail that sits within a location data service and pulling that up to a point where a decision maker who's got 10 minutes to kind of grasp it and use the data to understand it to make a decision, how do you kind of bridge that gap?
Right.
And provide that level of understanding? And I probably sit, a lot of my work is at that decision maker level. Interpreting the technical. I spent a lot of my career going to very intelligent, smart people and saying, pretend like I'm a 5-year-old and explain to me how your service works or why the data is as important as it is. And it's really about just trying to distill that essence and then get that communicatable information so that you can share it with the decision makers at that point.
Right. So I want to go a bit deeper into that, but just before that, I do wonder, like, is there a role in which there's you give that not just to the decision maker, but to the public as well? Because a lot of, if you ask people with location data, they're going to point at their phone and they're going to show you, oh, the GPS here, that's where location data comes from. And so that's like everybody moving around on their day-to-day life, they are creating that data. So there's a lot of involvement from everybody there. So is that also part of the work that you do to get people involved like that aren't necessarily in geospatial or in decision making?
So within Locus Charter, part of the reason for writing the charter was to, I guess, take a step forward in how we communicate out to the public and citizenry about what we do. So trying to find a better vocabulary and a more shared vocabulary in how we talk about what we do as a profession, so that it's easier for people to understand and so they can make a more educated. And it's a trust building exercise. If I can't understand your language, I can't trust you.
That's a good point.
So it's part of, when you look at the language of the Locus Charter, is very much about trying to find an easier to understand language to help us as professionals explain what we do, why we do it, and how we do it.
So let's go down the Locus Charter. What is it and where does it come from?
What is it and where does it come from? So it's a set of 10 principles plus a preamble that try to outline the principles, I guess, of good and responsible practice in relation to using location data. Where it came from was essentially 2 programs of work, both funded by the Media Network, to initially really just provide thought leadership in the space of sort of ethical and responsible use of location data. And it was about as nebulous as that, really, to start. We're talking kind of almost 2 years ago, pre-pandemic. And I think at that point, people had started to realize, you'd had sort of Cambridge Analytica, you'd started to see sort of, some insurance, and law enforcement use of location data in interesting ways. But I don't think people had really grasped an understanding of kind of what the issue really was at play here. so Benchmark started up, we had a couple of, managed to squeak in a couple of in-person roundtables and things here in the UK before we went online. And to some degree, actually going online was a great thing for us because it just opened the dialogue and it opened the thought leadership up to this, conversation about ethical use of location data to the world at that point. And so the engagement was huge. And our sort of sister program of work in the United States, Ethical Geo, was a little bit further ahead with us than us, but looking, I guess, a bit more at fellowships and some research kind of elements that they were looking at with that, but very similar concepts. And we kind of teamed up a little bit and said, there's really something bigger in this than just having roundtables. Let's have some workshops where we start to really pull apart what the values are within this idea of ethical use of location data. What are the principles people think fit in here? And very quickly you got to the word harms and you started hearing these stories about, I built this great system with this fantastic intention. And even though we thought it was great, there was this unintended consequence where people got impacted or people's privacy was impacted, or there was a vulnerable population that was exposed that shouldn't have been exposed. And, and the people building the solution using this incredible geographic data thought they were doing the right thing. They thought, they were like, I'm doing this with the best and right intentions. I had no idea that what I was doing could cause a problem at the other end of it. And sort of through tearing through these workshops and so forth, we really started to pull apart what we started to describe as the location data lifecycle. And there was this also location service lifecycle it morphed into. And that was a recognition that data is never just like one data set. Like, the issue comes more with the service it goes into, the different morphs and permutations it goes through over its existence. And then, what happens at the end of it? Is it deleted? Hardly ever. So what's the security? What's the reuse requirements? What's the, and what happens and who asks the questions at that point about that data? So what we found through all of these workshops was honestly a bunch of professionals in the world that work with geospatial data that said, I want to do the right thing. Like, all of them want to use it to create benefit in the world, to better understand the world that we live in. But they're all like, but if there's ethical and responsible issues I need to understand, I don't know what my framework is. And I don't have kind of a set of guidance that I can measure against or check against with what I'm doing. And so the Locus Charter kind of came out of that, really, that conversation with the professionals, with them kind of going, I need something that helps me put this into a bit of a framework so I can look at my work and I can look at my business and go, well, am I doing that? Am I kind of, doing those things? So that's really how Locus Charter ended up appearing, I guess, in March of this year.
And so I was also going through it and I was wondering, like, there's these sets of principles that you can apply to, but do you have also, say tomorrow someone comes up and they want to build something, like you were saying, it seems like a lot of the problems come from people who don't even realize. It's not evil people who are trying to, get the most evil out there. It's just without knowing it. So is there a way of like also knowing that, this company follows the charter and take that as example? Because I feel like also if you're building something, having not necessarily exactly put it down how to do it, but examples of how it's being implemented, that's really useful. So is there that as well? How does it go from this charter to the implementations and how other people down the line can use it?
So I think the thing to know about the charter is we really see that as the first step. This is a culture shift for us as a profession, really, is the way we see this, because this is not also about, looking at your project up front and going, well, we've looked at the 10, done, tick, and off we go. This is actually about, at each step within the cycle of your service, you're going to ask yourself a set of questions and you're going to write down the answers and you're going to work out how you're going to communicate that, and you're going to be transparent about each one of the trade-offs, changes, etc., that you are doing in this, so that people have trust. at the end of the day. And what ultimately that looks like is going to be different depending on the organization and going to be different on depending on the service. What you're describing, though, I've heard characterized really nicely, and I hope we get to the point of building this, which would be a registry of known harms, where we have an ability as a profession to say, well, we know that by, combining those two types of location information, you are going to expose people's privacy issues, on the other end of this. Or we know that if you take a vulnerable place, for example, like a sacred site or what have you, you place it in harm if you expose it at this level of resolution. So actually, what we learned out of that problem is that you should really show it at X, level of resolution instead, because it protects, the ability for it, of where it is.
So if sorry, go ahead.
No, go. So it was characterized really nicely. I thought the idea about a kind of global open source registry of harms where you can just contribute and say, well, my learning was X, we tried to do blah. This was the unintended consequence that came out the other end of it. This is what we did to fix that at the other end of it.
Right.
Or what we changed in future to mitigate that as a risk going forwards.
That sounds like a super interesting idea. So it would be kind of like, if I understand correctly, this like common experience of the entire field that's put together that you can go to and kind of leverage as you're trying to build new stuff, and that keeps getting updated because the data is going to keep getting better, the tools are going to keep getting better. So I'm guessing this is also something that needs to be living and growing. But that sounds like a really interesting idea. I don't know if there is any equivalent to that in any other field. I really wonder in practice what that would look like. Do you have any idea what something like this could look like?
I don't know. I mean, there's a bit of me that says it probably is something to live in a GitHub repo somewhere.
That's what I was going to ask.
Dominantly going to be a developers looking for it, and it's that whole structure where it needs to be a bit case study based. So am I doing a mobility project? Am I doing a urban planning project, or am I doing an environment project, etc.? Within that, what am I doing? Is there examples of others that have done things within this, and has someone characterized a harm that was found within this? Great example with the using personal devices is Strava, and the whole by publishing people's running paths and so forth, they created a fantastic map around a secret military base because that's where all the,
I also, when I saw that, I was like, oh God, someone's going to stalk someone else with this. Like, I didn't even want to look it up. But when I first started using that, I was like, all right, well, everybody knows where I live now. And I probably don't need to worry about that, but I know a lot of people who wouldn't want to even have to worry about that. So yeah, I can imagine that just having that, not necessarily for the public, but for people who also are building those things, because I'm sure Strava never thought about that. They were like, oh, cool, you could show your friends and it's going to be amazing and everything. So yeah, I could imagine. I'd be really curious to see that experiment go live and how it goes.
It's one of the reasons why I keep on mentioning it, hoping that someone's going to say, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. And so
all right. What's the response been so far? Because I think you put this out in March, right? It's been a couple months now.
Yeah.
At the time of recording this. So what's like kind of fresh off the press? What's been the response so far?
Bigger than I expected. I kind of, this is ethics. It's not like a front page story, if you like, in what we're talking about. So I think from our perspective, we're really thrilled with the organizations that have already come out and said, no, we just totally endorse that and adopt it. Look, Royal Geographical Society, for example, day after it appeared, we're signing up. Like, yes, we want to be involved with this. We want to support this. This is fantastic. And other bigger organizations like OGC, for example, another one that came out, very early on and sort of said, yes, absolutely, we subscribe to this. This is great. So I think the response we've had is fantastic. we're working out how to share sort of who has come forward to make sure that it's done in the right way. So that you'll see over the next couple of months, some of the work out of Ethical Geo and Benchmark will share more about who's actually signed up.
Right.
But I think really for us, it was that, it was picked up in media, there was a Wired article about it. So
okay.
They were kind of great examples for me that this was an issue that was it wasn't just the geospatial profession. This is something that actually others are grappling with. And I can, without naming names, some of the very big tech organizations have been in contact too and wanted to talk about it and sort of talk about its implications inside their own businesses and what they're doing. And to me, that was huge success to sort of see that. And governments that have come forwards and said, we think this is fantastic. We want to bake this into our policies of what we're doing. And when you start seeing that, you're like, well, actually, that's quite tangible. If you're going to turn around and actually start embedding this in practice. For me also just heartwarming to hear some of the SMEs that simply go, this is fantastic for us. Yeah. We want to totally bake this into what we do as far as our development cycles go. We're really looking for something like this that we can work with. And I like that because I thought, well, that's great because that shows to me a proactive profession that wants to be trusted and it wants to use geographic data to really support the world well. So they see it as an opportunity to really kind of, push forwards.
The thing I actually wanted to ask about that is from outside the geospatial community. So with friends, with family, I feel like there's been a conversation this year more with things like COVID. There's been this huge talk about contact tracking, where, we heard this huge story where Apple and Google were going to be working together, of all things. So there's been a lot of a focus there. Do you think that has contributed in any way to the response you've seen to the Locus Charter as well, where it's starting to be a thing? When you look also at the events from Google, there's one like a few weeks ago, from Apple a few days ago. It's like privacy is like a selling point now as well. So I feel like that's changed in not so much of a time frame. Do you think that has also an impact on that?
Absolutely. There is no doubt that when we started this process, location ethics was a fringe conversation, really. But suddenly we were in a pandemic where we were watching the front page of The Guardian here in the UK talking about the implications of what location tracking is, and questioning whether the government was really fit for handling that and doing it properly. Now, no comment on that in terms of my own opinions about that thing, but the perception was that this was something to be concerned about, and so you'll have this public. If you look at some of the Open Data Institute's research in the last little while too about public trust in relation to data, particularly in relation to governments, there is an erosion in trust at the moment of big organizations and of governments. And it's not to say that necessarily any of those organizations are doing anything wrong, but there is a perception that that's the case. And the trust element is really concerning. And I think one of the things that was really critical for us with Locus Charter was to try and really pick language that wasn't techie, wasn't difficult to understand, so that you had an easier entry point by which to grasp what it meant in that process.
So this is not just for the engineer building the thing, it's really for a much broader audience than that.
Absolutely. So this is, what I want is the engineer to pick this up, but then go and have a conversation with their boss, and say, this is actually about how we operate as a business, and the culture by which we look at, there was some, Andrew Zolli was on a panel that I did a couple of weeks ago from Planet. And it was really fascinating to listen to him talk about just that for them, this is something that is totally baked into what they do as an organization. This is in their practices. They already ask a lot of these questions within that as an organization. But to do that, you really, as he said, you have to have that buy-in from the complete top of your organization to shift that culture and to force that culture of ethics down through every aspect of what the organization's doing, so that it also flows and supports into the product. You know, you can't just say, well, that's the dev's job.
Yeah.
You know, or the geospatial guy's job.
Absolutely. But I think the ethics conversation for the past year has been a very interesting one. Google has had a huge amount of backfire for, well, firing a few people who were working on their ethics boards. And that probably didn't turn well. I'm not sure the general public is aware of that. Like, it did do a few headlines, but a lot of people working in the field. So that's more on the AI side. And then really, it's really interesting to see those companies where it's like big front and center on their marketing. It's like, oh yeah, we care about privacy, whether that is true or not. To see that it becomes this thing that is becoming like being sustainable is becoming these, like, seeing these things as selling points is really interesting to see happen in real time like that.
Well, and I think that in that regard, that this whole concept of being a trustworthy company is something that is rapidly coming as far as how we operate. You know, I think, how did I characterize it not that long ago? It's, if I look back at my career, you know, across the sort of 2000s and into the early part of this decade, it was like this golden roller coaster of innovation. You know, if you said the word innovation, everyone was like, oh, we'll give you more money. Off you go. Keep building, make more maps, you know, put them online, build sensors that collect lots of data. Yeah, put up sats and we'll get more pictures of the planet, you know, just do it. And I think it's only recently that in the last sort of 5 years or so, where we've just got to this incredible, dense, precise level of location information that people are starting to go, I feel a little uncomfortable about this.
Right. Yeah.
Now, like the volume of, and now that that's also got, you know, AI and machine learning algorithms being passed over that too, to try and gain more information about you and make predictions about you and try and alter your behavior. You know, once upon a time, it was just a map. Like, you know, it was just a, you know, a bit of paper that showed things that, and they were physical and I could see them. Now there is all of this insight that attaches to the location, and it's the location itself and how you interact with that place that becomes insightful for people as well. So it's become so much more personal at this point that it's, I think naturally that innovation roller coaster, people have started to pull the reins and go, I know you can do that. But should you do that?
Right. Yeah.
Or should you put that sensor on that vehicle so that it can be tracked? I know that that means that you understand more about the driving behavior. But is that okay?
Yeah.
You know, is that all right? You know, one of the examples I always give is that for me, that was like a light bulb moment was I was at an insurance industry event and we were talking about sensors. And the topic, the title for the talk that we were doing was called When Does Cool Become Creepy? And it was the whole idea of this world, our houses now got an Alexa and an internet connected fridge that checks how much we're eating and drinking, and, you know, light bulbs that are connected up with Wi-Fi as well, and cameras that are at our doorbells and what have you. And I said to this group of insurance people, you know, hands up, who would be happy to share the information about how many lights they switch on and off, you know, and have that internet connected and the TV and all of this stuff, and share that with your insurance company if it gave you lower premiums. And they were all like, yeah, sure, totally fine. And I said, okay, how many of you would still do that if they could differentiate between whether it was you or your child that was doing that inside your house? It's the same from the computer's perspective, exactly the same information, but they just know which one it is. And they all went, oh, no. Now I'm uncomfortable. You know, you can't do it if it's collecting about my kids.
Yeah.
So ethical at that point. You know, there's a whole ethical dilemma at that point. So that's our boundary as a society at that stage. It's okay if I'm an adult and I make a consenting choice to have my location information shared, but I'm not comfortable in any way if it's my child or someone, you know, who's underage or vulnerable, etc. within that. But how do you define all of that? And where do you put those boundaries, and whose responsibility is it to protect the location of those people at that point?
This is something I also kind of wanted to ask, and goes a little bit beyond just the location aspect. But I really like what you said about this is like a societal thing where we like nobody says this is ethical, this doesn't. You don't go to someone. Well, there is people who know more about it, but it's this very like gray zone about what is ethical, what isn't. And then that probably also depends on what is society like. There's just such a different spread of cultures, of things that are acceptable, things that aren't. Is that something that you guys try to take into account as well? In like, maybe are we just projecting too much like how we think about it? And how do you try to balance this? This is a tricky like thing to
It is a
answer, but
really
I'm
tricky.
really curious about that.
So I think the important thing to recognize is that the way we put this together was we really went out and tried to talk with as many people globally as we could. So we definitely tried to get the geographic spread of professionals into the conversation with us, to sort of make sure that the principles we were putting together was not just like a UK or an Australia or a US kind of perspective, but it was trying to grapple with everybody there. I think the other thing to remember about the way we put this charter out too was to say we have no expectation that this is now set in stone.
Okay.
There is, we fully expect that in time elements of this will change. Wording might need to change. Arrangements of things, a principle might actually no longer be relevant. And for exactly that reason, that society changes, our perception of what's okay changes. If you think back from a human rights perspective, once upon a time it was totally fine to have someone in slavery, and that was just socially an acceptable thing to do. Now from our perspective, living in enlightened times of 2021, we can totally sit back and judge and go, you should never have done that. And
that's a great point.
But it's wrong from our perspective, our current perspective in time, and I think that what that shows is that we as a human population, we change over time, and what we see as ethical and what we see as responsible will shift in that sort of way. Hopefully we have some fundamentals now about human life and human rights, and there are elements of that within here. So definitely Declaration of Human Rights was one of those charters that we looked at when we looked at this, and you'll see things in there that around the harm or around like protection of the vulnerable within this, and they're very much taken from that sort of realm of things. If you shouldn't be doing things that cause a human harm, that or cause generally I think probably there's others that would say that there's a charter for environmental rights that should be written as well.
Right. Yeah, especially when you start saying cause no harm, that's like really wide depending on who you ask.
Exactly. What is harm?
And
actually, is there an acceptable harm?
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
But that's often the case. Take for example, great geographic case study of we've got a huge expanding population that we need to shift down bigger, better roads. Now in the process of doing that, we now have to put a 4-lane highway through what was a pristine part of chalk area that's got old growth forests and endangered species, etc. Is that okay? And what's the harm done if you don't do it? Well, actually you have a whole population that can't get to work, hasn't got good opportunities to get to employment places, so in that, that's the ethical thing. It's the ethical dilemma of actually you have to make a value judgment and you have to make a trade-off. I think with us, with the Locus Charter, what we're trying to say is that pretty much any time you're working with location data, there's some sort of trade-off. You didn't have quite all the data. You couldn't quite collect all the geography you wanted. You couldn't quite didn't have the time to do the detail that you wanted within the data. It missed a section of the population whose location information we should have had as part of this. So we have a known bias. I think what the Charter is about is trying to encourage professionals to articulate that and to be more transparent with the fact that this is just part of using data.
Yeah, like get the ball rolling on the conversation about like let's start asking, should we do this? Should we not? And that's how you at least can go towards having some change.
Yeah.
One of the things I really liked, I was listening to a previous conversation you had on another podcast, and one of the things that came up is the difference between what you're trying to do and compared to having a legislation. And one of the things I really liked is this notion that legislation is sometimes quite slow, and especially in this fast-moving tech world, the I don't know if this is a term, but legislative innovation, like how fast we can build laws, is probably like an order of magnitude, if not more, slower than how technology changes. So do you think that's also why this is maybe a good way to not go down the legislative route? Because also it feels like we're still bound by some laws from so long ago that just don't make sense at all anymore today. And it's like starting to get really tricky where you say you can't do this, and then maybe in like 20 years it's just completely stupid or irrelevant, let's not say stupid, but irrelevant to have that law.
So I think the important thing is, and this probably comes from the fact that I'm actually a graduate of public policy and politics in my degree.
Okay.
There is place for all, and they're different instruments for different reasons. There is always going to be an important place for legislature and for laws. There's absolutely is, and it is slow for a reason.
Right.
Because actually it's not that it's slow, it's that it's thorough. And you don't go creating a law until you really know you have the evidence
right.
that it's going to be the right thing to do. And no law should be created until, and that's why you have policy before that often to sort of test the waters a bit and to see how a citizenry is going to react, or how a set of businesses are going to react with all of that as well. I think this is actually often how laws come about.
Okay.
Is that you find within society or within professions around the world that people come together because they've got a challenge, and ultimately they need a set of rules. So like for us, we had the workshops and so forth, and this set of professionals within the geospatial space said to us, we feel like we don't have a common understanding or a common set of rules by which we can measure against this when it comes to ethical and responsible use. We think we know what some of the principles are, but we haven't got this like agreed written down set. And that's where and so you get together and they all write a set, and you create a club basically that says, we're all part of the ethics club that says this is our set of principles, yay us, and we go forth and we start trying to use those. And then they might change a bit because you realize actually it's not quite worded properly, or this doesn't really work in practice, so you fix a few elements of it. But hopefully over time that sort of set of rules becomes so embedded in what everybody does that actually it's really commonly accepted this is the way you should do things. And it's
right.
kind of
okay, I see.
That you start to get standards at that point, and you can really put and say, well, okay, well, this is a standard, everybody should use this, or this is the law, everybody should use this way. Okay. So I think there's that's the pathway I see for this. I mean, obviously governments can also say there's a fundamental problem, let's create a law to fix that problem, and and that's a very blunt use of the law at that point.
Yeah. It sounds like it's a very tricky thing to get right as well, where you don't completely hinder innovation for the future, but you also kind of say there's something wrong that we need to fix here.
Yeah.
So I want to switch gears a little bit, and I do want to go over like, how did you get to where you are today? How does one end up working on location data ethics?
The location, well, it depends. How far do you want me to go back?
How far are you willing to go back?
Well, so I guess I just mentioned I've got my undergrad was in public policy and politics back in Melbourne. So I've always, I guess, had an environmental bent in what I wanted. I always wanted to do things, my mum famously said when I was 9 that I watched some program on Japanese whaling and told her I was going to become an international lawyer so I could prosecute the Japanese for whaling. And she was like, you probably will. So I think I always kind of wanted to be working in spaces that allowed me to make the world better than what I found it in at the time. I've always kind of wanted to work in those sorts of fields. I was never interested in selling stuff for the sake of selling stuff or so I could get money. It was always about what can I do with what I'm doing. And so with that, I kind of applied to a graduate program in public service. Thought that would be a good idea to go into government. And in that, I fell into geospatial. Back in an era where everything was still on a desktop GIS, trying to shift data around required sticking it on what we used to call the football, which was a massive hard drive thing that you would physically take from one building to the next, and then you plug it into the computer and upload your data to kind of do that with. And sort of really, that sort of early 2000s, the web was such an emerging thing at that stage, and the idea of shifting any sort of big mapping data at that point was just crazy. But within 5 years, Google had bought Keyhole, and suddenly we had Google Maps appear in the mid-2000s with that. So for me, career-wise, I just completely and utterly shifted at that point.
Okay.
So I worked in government for 12 years. Started getting involved, interestingly, in that standards space, and with OGC, and sort of looking at those rules about how we use geospatial. And I spent a lot of time in that, trying to, I guess, play interpreter between really, really smart brains the size of planets in terms of what people could compute and do with their geospatial, but a vocabulary about mapping that was just so difficult to understand for a lot of people in decision making to grasp the value, I guess, of what they had in that geospatial data that was there. And I think also trying to untangle at that stage as well, what's the responsibility of the private sector when it comes to geospatial data? What's the responsibility of government in that? What's the responsibility of the academics in that? How do we all work together to realize the benefit for the world of this incredible geographic resource that we've all got? So post the government thing, I took a crazy job with an international standards body and moved overseas with small children. And what OGC and that kind of outreach role that I did there gave me was this incredible view of a planet and the myriad of different ways that we use geospatial data for decision making, sometimes well, oftentimes poorly. Going back to some of that stuff we talked about before, that real difference in how cultures attach information to place and what that means to us as a humanity in different parts of the world as well. And so I stayed with OGC doing a lot of that stuff for a long period of time. I got to fly drones in Africa and, go give presentations at the UN and all of these sorts of places. And so the ethics, I think, for me, if you look at that career from that early stage where it was just really about initially trying to get a digital map that worked on the web, or connecting or having a sensible, geocoding register that you could for addresses within a country kind of thing. Going through that, innovation cycle of suddenly just processing power, battery power, mobile devices, crowdsourcing, it just went, it was like you had this narrow little field and then suddenly it just went, out in terms of what was capable and what was amazing. And I think to me, getting to the ethics and where I am now was such a natural progression of where we are maturity wise. I almost liken it to being like a child, back in the kind of early stages where we were very simple, very kind of, easy to contain sort of arrangement of what we did back in the late 90s, early 2000s, into kind of being teenagers where we just wanted to try everything, and it's just innovate to now. I think we've kind of, as a profession, where I'm at now, the ethics made a lot of sense here because I think it's about us really maturing now as a geographic analysis and insight kind of profession. So that's kind of how I got to.
So this young adult that starts realizing that when it does stuff, it has an impact on the world.
Yeah, I think everybody's always known that. I think now we just realize it's not even that we realize the gravity of it, it's that there's a lot of responsibility now being placed upon the data that we as a profession create about the world that will really influence. If you look at things like the Sustainable Development Goals and just how much geographic information you need to even begin to comprehend what you do about each one of those goals, there's a massive responsibility for us as a profession.
Do you think it makes sense to call this the geospatial field in the first place? Like, because you said one of the very first things you said was that this is like, it's great because it plugs into everything. So does it make sense to say it's a field that touches in everything?
I think it does. And I think actually, I struggle with this language wise. Geospatial has always been a word that I have a funny relationship with, even though I know that that's what I work within. I once got asked at a conference, actually, if you could change just one thing about the geospatial community or profession, what would you change? And I said the word geospatial.
For what?
Well, I think, and that's the challenge, I think, because it is so broad. Right. In recent times, I've shifted, you'll see in the Locus Charter, for example, you see the word, you don't see geospatial, you see location all the time. You'll see me use the word place a lot. And I think place versus location often to me sounds quite almost sanitized. I can disconnect myself from a location.
But yeah, it's like a point on a map somewhere.
That's it. But my places are personal. My home, the school my kids go to, the shops that I go to, they're all my places. So right. They evoke different emotional responses in people. But I think as a discipline, actually, if I'm being really honest, it's geography. It always has been, actually. What this is all about is understanding the geographic, extents, insights, elements of the planet that we inhabit as a human population. But for some reason, that word geography or geographic has fallen out of this favor, and people have this.
Yeah, it doesn't sound cool. Like it sounds old or something. Cool. Yeah.
But actually, when you look at what the field of geography has done through history, it's like the world wouldn't, our human populations wouldn't be the way they are. They wouldn't be where they are without the field of geography.
This is pretty fun because when I was a kid in high school, I loved a lot of stuff. And one thing I told myself was like, I can work in anything except that. And then here you are.
But and it's so fun. I don't know how that's happened, that this over time with us as a humanity, that this word geography is not cool. I'm like,
yeah,
it's amazing. Like, actually when you look at the field and what it encompasses, you're like, actually this is incredible.
Yeah, maybe it's because we have this image of like you're in primary school and there's like you have this globe and it's like, all right, where is, I don't know, Germany, and then where is Egypt? And it's like this thing where you just see these huge massive maps with like a ton of stuff on them and they're super ugly. And maybe it's just a way to say, hey, let's put that aside. I don't want to see that. That's not what I'm doing.
No, you want me as a parent walking into your primary school with like pictures of submarine drones and so forth and saying, this is geography. Like,
yeah, that's
modern day geographers do.
That's actually something I wanted to touch upon. Like, what do you think is the role of education here? There's a lot of stuff where I think, especially from what I've seen, there's been a huge uptake in let's try to make science more accessible. There's been a lot of work on that. I think YouTube, for example, has been like a massive platform for education. There's been a lot of books that are written in a bit of a different way. There's a lot of stuff on the internet, but it sounds like it's always for like physics or math. But then there's this like thing that is a bit geography, and then it's still like the old school geography. But I haven't seen that much about people talking about what we do, what geospatial is. It feels like there's a bit of still a gap somewhere. Maybe it's just me that hasn't found it and it's out there, but I have this feeling, and I wanted to know, like, what do you think about, the role of education and just in general in our field?
I think I agree with you entirely. I'm frustrated with how geography is represented within the education system in that regard, because I think, sure, there's the globe and there's knowing where all of the cities are in the world and those sorts of things. But actually, it's so much bigger than that. And it is that learning about volcanoes and, the structure of the earth. It is learning about the rivers that are within that as well. It's learning about human population and migration and so forth. But somewhere in the way that is taught, it turns so many people off. And I wonder whether what's missing is that technology connection, and for us, the exciting thing about geography and for, why it's geospatial, I guess, is that's the tech. It's what we can do now with the satellite imagery.
That's a great point.
The sensors and with, the robotics and the drones and all that. Now, if you suddenly found a way to bring that into the classroom, and got the kids to fly drones over their local city and then build a planning map off the back of that, which is what really happens now, you think that they might be a bit more interested?
Yeah, that's the cool thing now. Yeah.
Or take the set of electric sensors and program them and put them in the river so that you can check water quality for 3 weeks and then go back and get your results and see what happened.
Right. That's a great point. Like maybe it's the technology that turns geography into geospatial. It's like the building the stuff. It's not, oh, there's a volcano here. It's like, let's figure out how we even know there's a volcano here. It's about, oh yeah, we know this mountain is this big, but that's boring. But then we made this whole elevation model with like a gazillion sensors, and we can actually track how tall Mount Everest is or something. And then it becomes geospatial and not geography that maybe just consumes the results of that process.
I think you're right in that regard. And I think that's where perhaps the education systems, and maybe it's just an evolution of time type of thing. Technology, I think, is still having its struggle in working out where it fits within an educational process, particularly, I think, in those primary and secondary education elements. And it often takes like a parent who works in that gets invited to come into school, then shows that this career exists, and that's a thing that they can do. I remember taking in Lego robots and building Lego robots with kids to sort of then explain kind of how these get used in geospatial kind of context to data collect, or to, you might use them in an emergency services context to go in with a camera and then see what the place is or scan it.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the really cool, just there, like one of the really cool things I do think is maybe, and this is maybe just me, but I feel like with the internet and with a lot of stuff, we're also shifting towards education stops at high school. And then it's like some folks get the like degree or stuff. But I feel like now there's so much things that you can also consume as an adult. Like it's not just like, oh, you go to school and that's what education is. It's also about, in a way, I would argue that the work you're doing is also about educating people about, this to go all the way back, what we were saying about this registry of people who have done these mistakes. Like that's kind of a way of doing that. And then it's just broadening it up. I'm thinking about things like very different things like Neil deGrasse Tyson. Like that's an educator, but not necessarily just for kids. And like we don't have a rock star like that for geospatial. Like, oh, this guy, he's the map builder guy or whatever. So yeah, it's I'm curious to see if someone or some people, like multiple people, that would be even better, start taking up that space and how that goes, because there's a lot of really cool stuff to take out there, and I'd love to see people start taking that and being the like, oh, you think maps, this is the guy you kind of think in the general knowledge of people.
So one of my rock stars in that space is without doubt Elaine Ball and her Get Kids into Survey stuff that she has been doing, which has created an entire comic book series that, is the story of being a surveyor, but it looks so cool. Like, these are kind of, you give these to little kids and they're like, this is awesome. I want to be a surveyor on the back of this.
That's awesome. I have to check that out. I hadn't heard about her work.
I love them. And I think that's some of the stuff that we need to do. We need to create those characters, and we need to look at the fact that kids these days consume information in different ways. So you're absolutely right. We need You need to see the geospatial person doing the funky. I mean, that said, you know, we are there in various, you know, futuristic films, and, you know,
That's
so
true.
forth. You do see them, but we're not. It's, and the problem we've got then is that language problem, is that it will be described in different ways. We know it's a geospatial activity that the person's doing. It's often not described as that. It's like the law enforcement person that's, you know, using a funky touch screen to pinch maps and do analysis.
Yeah. But I think that's just tech in general. It's like you zoom on an image, it's like enhance, and you can see the
Yeah.
like plate number or something. I think, you know, this field is not the only one that gets completely destroyed. I want to move forward a little bit, and I saw that you joined the advisory board of, I think it's called Place.
Yep.
And it's, I think if I get this right, it's part of something that's called a data trust. And so I want to understand, what is that and what is your role there?
So it is a data trust, I think, is
Okay,
probably
right. Well, that's why I need to ask this question.
Yeah, no, it's a good, it's an excellent question. What is, so first of all, I'm on the advisory board. So that's a group of us that are from, I guess, you know, experts in the geospatial field, really diverse group of experts, I should say, as well. So there's those of us in it that are really techie. There are those of us that are strategy. There are those of us that are kind of policy and government. So we're a massive mix of people that they've put together for this. It's an NGO, so it's a, you know, it's a not-for-profit type of organization, very much based on creation of geospatial data for the public good. So it's about building an organization that has got, you know, to a large extent, that ethics and trust component completely built into the foundations of the organization. So the whole governance structure for Place is very much about looking at, how do you build an organization that's going to collect data such as aerial photography or, say, streetscape information? How do you build an organization like that, but make their practices so transparent and so sort of easy for people to see and keep, you know, responsible? How do you build a governance structure like that? That means that organization will just be, people will simply be able to look at it and go, well, of course I trust that. You know, that's operating in a way that I can understand and I can appreciate. The other really important thing about that data trust, and one of the reasons why I love the concept of data trusts, is that it's sometimes described as almost like the club model, and you go back to that set of rules. So, you know, you join the club and you say, when you do that, I agree that I will abide by the rules of the club. You know, so here is how I need to behave as an organization. And so from the perspective of Place, that means all of their members need to be good actors. They need to be good in what they're going to do with the data. They need to be, and so there's an expectation that if you're part of the Place data trust, that you are going to behave responsibly.
So is this for individuals, for other organizations? Who's this for? At
the moment, it's a good question. It's in its early stages, I think. Okay. The description. I think at the moment, really, when you look at Place, it's probably more looking at organizations.
Okay.
In the first instance, but I think as the organization grows, and we continue to explore what that means to be, you know, in the public interests, then those other opportunities will start to appear in what that needs to look like. And I think one of the great things about the Place model and what it's looking at is really to sort of be agile enough that actually it can respond to those needs as that appears. So it's not about sort of setting everything in stone at the very beginning.
Right.
But you do it, but any of those changes that come in a transparent way and are open enough for everybody to sort of, and there is a whole governance process in place that reviews that sort of a change and tries to nut through all of those issues that we've talked about before, about the harms, about the unintended consequences. You know, if we open this to all individuals, can we control that? You know, can we influence, you know, what happens, what are we giving up by opening that to individuals versus, you know, commercial organizations or government organizations or private, you know, or academic ones? How do we define that purpose by which people can and can't use this? It's complex, but I think the great thing about a trust model is that it's not, you don't have the same sort of boundaries, if you like, that a government has, and that sort of difference between different national structures in that regard. You don't have the sort of competitive component necessarily that you sort of get with being in a commercial organization. What you do is provide a fantastically safe space for those entities to interact with each other over the same type of data. And hopefully what you do is reduce that duplicative collection of data.
Right.
And so that, importantly for Place 2, and one of the reasons why I was really happy to join the advisory board is that they have a policy of not parachuting in the experts from another country to go and do that data stuff. They're about empowering capability and upskilling people that exist within a national context. And so therefore saying, well, this is a business that we need to make sure is sustainable within that country with local people. And so going back to the kind of local conversation and people in their places, you can parachute someone in from the UK into Uganda. How on earth is that person from the UK? They might be a technical expert, but they're not an expert in the local customs, what's acceptable or what's not.
That makes a lot of sense. This is probably a stupid question, but what's the difference between this and the Locus Charter itself, actually? Like, I'm not quite sure I understand. Yeah, what are the difference between what the Locus Charter is trying to do, which to me is those sets of guidelines, and this data trust, which I also feel like is a set of guidelines, but there's probably something I'm missing there.
Well, I think one is an organization. So Place is an organization that has signed up to the Locus Charter.
Okay, right. Okay, there we go.
I think that what they are is the Locus Charter is an international charter. It's not owned by any one organization. It's a collaborative, collective of the world's professionals that relate to this. What Place is, though, is one of those organizations that has gone and taken that 10 principles and said, well, we totally believe this. How do we build an organization that embodies this, in practice? So the charter itself doesn't make products, it doesn't build maps, but an organization like Place is going to go and build maps and build product. But, what I'm, incredibly hopeful of is that it will do so embodying those 10 principles as it operates.
Right. And that is what is defined as a data trust.
Well, that's Place's version of a data trust, but essentially, it's having a trusted repository or group of entities that is are built around data in that regard.
That makes a lot of sense. On that, I actually wanted to ask. So for code, there's this notion of open source, which is pretty simple when you think about it. It's like someone writes a bunch of code that does a bunch of stuff, and they just put it out there, and other people can first look at it, second modify it and contribute to it. And this is something that is pretty mature. There's still a bunch of stuff we haven't figured out, like how to make it really viable. But it's a really common practice across a lot of things. And then there's data where there's open data sets that are more static. It's like, this is it. It's kind of like here, it's static, and there's this bunch of images that you have here. There's then things like OpenStreetMap, which is kind of a data set, but also a community. How do you think it goes for data? And it feels like it hasn't necessarily, there isn't like a model like there is for code, which code is like the tools and data is like the fuel that you can use those tools on. How does that work for data in your opinion?
I think it comes back, this is one of those interesting sort of things. I think it comes back to data is such it's a little word. It's a massive thing. And it comes back to that concept within our geographic sort of world where we talk about fit for purpose. And whether something is open source or, freely available or accessible or all these sorts of things is it's not that it's not relevant, but to me, it's actually, well, what's what do you need it for? What's it trying to solve? And okay, so now that I know that this is the problem in the world that I need information to help solve, where does that data, how does that data need to be collected? Who does it need to be available to? How does that need to be available at that point? Does it need to be, and actually, can it be collected once and then it's just the data set, in which case, okay, well, actually, I can sync my costs for that and just have it available via, an API that's very low cost for me to make available for people to use? Or is this actually a really fundamentally important piece of data that's going to change fairly regularly, that needs huge maintenance, has massive cost associated with doing it, but was still really, really important? But you can't really make that freely available because you've got to find some way to fund looking after it. So I think this is one of those, the open data movement of things. I love a lot of the principles within that, but I always come back to that fit for purpose, and maintainability. And there's a big difference between a static data set that is, a point in history that was perhaps collected as a byproduct of a project that you can just make available, versus, say, the property cadastre for a country that underpins multi-billion-dollar real estate industry, and is fundamental to the planning processes of a country, that actually you really want to know that it's authoritative, you really want to know that it's got high quality. You're going to want the company behind it to morph and change the technology as the technology shifts and pay for all of that. So who's going to pay for that?
Yeah. This is where I do think like OpenStreetMap is this really interesting approach to it, because it does change over time. It does evolve over time. And all these problems that, or let's not necessarily problem, but challenges that you pointed out, I feel like we have them in code as well, like in open source code, like, something like QGIS, something like GDAL, like these tools that, well, the data we consume is change as well. And so it does feel like there's quite a bit of parallel there on how we are to deal with it. It's just that code can relatively simply, and I'm going to put some big quote marks there, be done with someone sitting in the computer pretty much anywhere. Data and acquiring data is a bit trickier and probably has a lot of a higher investment in it to be acquired in the first place. So there probably is, like, maybe this is like the wrong question even to ask. There probably is some like parallels that make it completely different, but I'm really curious to see how that will go in the future, where there's this concept of like open data and those open data movements, as you were saying. That's, yeah. And again, like one of those things where it's like interesting to take a backseat place and say like, all right, I'm going to kind of see how this pans out and how this goes. Because it's pretty interesting to see kind of unfold there. One thing I also want to ask is, you've mentioned a lot about non-for-profit organizations. Why, like that seems to be like a major part of the work that you've done. Can I ask why?
One of the great things about sort of the non-government or not-for-profit type of space is that it enables you to, I guess, connect across all aspects of the geospatial community. So within it, you typically kind of work with, whether it's, me working in AGI or OGC, they tend to be organizations that are founded for a particular purpose that you can kind of get behind. But they, I guess, for what I do and what I think I do well is partnership build. So they're organizations that allow me to reach out to any corner or any element of the profession and try and bring people together. And I think some of the parts of my career that I've enjoyed most is watching when you've brought, say, a government entity together with a private sector organization and with perhaps an NGO, and the three of them have gone and made something amazing,
right?
In partnership. And I think that you're kidding yourself in the technology space if you think that any one of those things can exist without each other.
Okay, that's a good point.
So I think that, for me, I really enjoy catalysting when you can bring them together to do something incredible.
Right. Why wouldn't they be able to work together? Like I tend to agree with that, but I'm actually thinking, and I wonder why.
So I guess sometimes within from a private sector perspective, it's challenging in certain situations for them to direct connect with another competitor to operate. So doing that through a membership organization or through a NGO makes the conversation a lot easier to be had. Same with in governments, you've got a lot of procurement regulation and rules about how you talk to the private sector, and you can only do things through a tender, and you can only do things through this. But you can go and be a member of a membership organization that's related to the profession that's got private sector members, and then you can have a conversation as part of the membership that allows you to push the technology forwards, that allows you to look at the problems. And sometimes, in the case of, say, OGC's innovation program, allows you to build a project that is, proof of concept, that brings together academics, that brings together private sector, that brings together government,
right,
all under the one project.
I feel like sometimes, especially in the recent years, it does feel like in tech in general, there's like a few of these companies that are just dominating the whole scene and are still growing and dominating even more in that in pretty much everything. Like now you have this company who was a search engine who does like everything, and then there was this one who started building computers that's just also doing everything, and like it's surreal to watch just how much stuff they try to have a foot into. And so sometimes it kind of feels like, well, they're just doing everything and they're like making all the decisions for us, and they're like holding themselves back as well. So in that context, I do believe like what you're saying is true. Like I feel it's also maybe a way to keep themselves accountable, where you need some external entity that is maybe the government that says, hey, what you're doing there, I don't know, whatever FANG company, you shouldn't be doing that. But then having someone that's also external to the government that says, hey, the government and the FANG, whatever you're doing, that kind of sucks. And then whatever corporate big tech company being like, well, we have the funds, let's just do this thing because we can just throw money at it. And so, again, it's probably something I don't know much about, but it's really interesting to see that as well develop and go through like those interactions between them. And it is a bit frustrating sometimes to not hear enough about those projects that are not directly coming out from these huge corporate companies. And it's kind of refreshing to hear what we just heard, all of that there's a lot of work, that there is a lot of things that are done there to try to, first of all, narrow a bit what they're doing, but also kind of guide them and keep themselves accountable as well, which is probably really important as well.
I would say that's true. I've had across the career, it's interesting. I think it's very easy to look at big organizations and look at big governments and make big sweeping statements about them and their intentions as an organization as a whole. I think people forget that all organizations are made up of individuals to some degree, and they can be good individuals, they can be bad individuals that are within that. So I guess maybe I'm a bit Pollyanna in the way I look at the world, but I like to believe that most people actually are good at heart. And I think that, whilst commercial organizations are always looking for a commercial edge, I mean, that's part of business. That's, be realistic, in sort of what you expect out of that. I think that actually there's sometimes those big entities are a little misunderstood. And also there's a very great willingness to ignore the good that they also do. And the services that they do bring within that. But I think that's probably a whole nother conversation.
No, but I think that's a really good point. Like, I think there's a place for all these different structures that have different incentives. Like NGOs have very specific incentives as well. Governments have very specific incentives, and for-profit has very specific incentives. They're just different, and I think they do align on a lot of stuff. I do want to bring this question up again because I think it's a pretty fun one. We've gone over a lot of really cool stuff. And so this is a bit of a tangent, but do you have any interesting books that you're reading at the moment that you think are interesting to talk about?
Oh, ones that are interesting. Do you know, I recently I have just been reading sustainability textbooks. So predominantly in the last
Okay.
couple of weeks, I've got a huge stack of books. Like I've got the Bill Gates one, the recent Bill Gates one that's sitting on my desk at the moment.
So that's How to Avoid a Climate Disaster, I think the name of it.
Yeah, How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. So that's sitting there ready to be read soon,
okay.
hopefully. What else have I got? I'd have to go back and have a look at what's on my bedside.
Yeah, I mean, sustainability sounds nice. I don't know if you said they're textbooks, they're probably not the best bedtime books.
No, they're probably not the best bedtime books. I mean, you know, one of the ones that I think I've loved the most was definitely Kate Raworth's Donut Economics.
Okay.
And just kind of that refreshing way of looking, you know, and to a large extent, it's you know, sustainability in a nutshell. You know, it's like, how do you create these spaces where actually the amount of resources that you use can somehow be replenished,
right.
Or be reused within all of that. So I think that's you know, that coupled with the studies that I did around things like the waste hierarchy and kind of understanding that, you know, it's not just about recycle. Actually, what you really should everybody be talking about is reusing.
Yeah.
Reuse, not having to go through the exercise.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing. Well, the first one is just like use less, then reuse. Then at the very last, when you're kind of out of options, you should recycle. But cool, I'll check that one out. I've heard a bunch of stuff about it, and that's kind of how I get started on books. Just like get recommended them like enough times that I'm like, all right, I'm gonna go read this. So yeah, this was really interesting conversation. It was really fun as well. So thanks a lot for wasting a bunch of time with me and taking some time to talk about you and your work.
No, I'm more than happy to. It was an interesting.